good evening. Wherever you are, whatever hour the clock has reached in your part of the world, let the room settle. Turn the lamp down, if there is a lamp. Let your shoulders come away from your ears. You do not need to follow every detail of what follows, and you are not being asked to remember any of it. This is a long story told slowly, and if you fall asleep in the middle of it, then it has done exactly what it was built to do. Tonight we are going back roughly 500 years to a palace on the south bank of the Thames, downriver from London, in the reign of the 8th Henry, to sit on the English throne. The place is Greenwich. The month is January. The year is 1535. And you are going to spend one entire day there, from the dark before dawn to the moment the Queen's bed curtains are pulled closed at night, standing in the shoes of a woman whose job it was to be present. That word matters. Job, because here is what most people picture when they think of a lady at the Tudor court. They picture a young woman in a heavy jeweled gown of crimson velvet, standing near a window, doing very little. She has small white hands that have never lifted anything heavier than a lute. Her days are a soft procession of banquets, hunting parties, whispered flirtations behind carved screens, and the occasional dramatic glance across a crowded hall. She is decorative. She is ornamental. She exists in the picture the way a tapestry hanging exists, to fill the wall behind the important people and to look expensive while doing it. That version has been repeated so many times, in so many novels and films and paintings, that it has hardened into something that feels like knowledge. It is not knowledge. It is set dressing. The real thing was a paid position. A woman who served in the Queen's chamber held an office. She had a title that was written down. She had a fee, paid in installments, recorded by clerks in the household accounts, alongside the wages of the cooks and the grooms and the men who carried firewood. She had a diet, meaning an allowance of food and drink calculated to a set number of loaves and gallons per day. She had a lodging, or at least a share of one. She had a place in a written order of precedence that determined which door she could walk through, which room she could stand in, whose hand she could touch, and in what sequence she performed the small physical tasks that made up her working life. She also had duties, real ones, hours of standing, hours of kneeling, hours of silence in rooms where the wrong sentence, said to the wrong person, could unmake a family. She carried things. She held things. She dressed another woman's body every morning and undressed it every night, in a fixed ceremonial order, in front of witnesses. She sewed. She sang. She danced when required, and dancing was required. She travelled several times a year with the whole apparatus of the court, packing her entire worldly possessions into a single chest and following the carts to the next house. And all of this was accounted for on paper. That is the part that undoes the myth most completely. We can go and look. The Tudor household kept records of a kind that would satisfy a modern auditor. And better than that, the Great Wardrobe kept accounts of cloth issued to named women. So we can see how many yards of velvet went to which lady in which year, and what colour it was, and whether it was furred. Gift rolls survive listing what each member of the household gave the king at New Year, and what he gave back. Ordinances survive, setting out how many servants each rank of person was permitted to keep at court, and how much bread and ale and fuel and candle each of them was owed per day. We can reconstruct, in remarkable detail, the material conditions of a woman's employment in 1535. So this is not the fairy tale version. This is not the version where a young woman with an interesting profile drifts through gilded rooms being noticed. This is the version that starts in the dark of a January morning, in an unheated stone chamber, with frost on the inside of the window glass, and does not finish until well past nightfall, when the last candle in the Queen's bedchamber is snuffed, and the curtains around the bed are drawn shut, and somebody, quite possibly you, lies down on a pallet nearby in case she wakes and wants something. That is the day we are going to walk through, hour by hour, slowly. Along the way, we are going to stop, fairly often, and pull back from the scene to look at how things actually worked. What a court gown was made of, and why it could not be put on alone. What a woman in your position was actually paid, and why the payment was frequently less than the cost of holding the position, and why families competed ferociously for it anyway. How a meal for hundreds of people was produced daily from kitchens with no refrigeration and no reliable clock. Why the entire court packed up and moved every few weeks. What a bell in a chapel tower had to do with the fact that almost nobody owned a watch. How a request from a farmhouse in Kent could travel through a chain of favours and cousins and letters into the hands of a queen. Those digressions are not interruptions. They are the point. The scene tells you what the day felt like. The digressions tell you why the day was shaped that way, and both together are the closest we can get to standing in that cold gallery at first light. Before we go, one small thing, and then I will not mention it again. If you find this useful for sleeping, subscribing helps more people find it, and it costs you nothing but a tap. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is where you are lying. I read them, and there is something quietly pleasant about seeing the same story landing at 2 in the afternoon in one place and 3 in the morning in another. Now then, let me tell you a little about where we are going before we arrive, so that the arrival makes sense. Greenwich in the 1530s is one of the King's favourite houses. It sits directly on the river, which is the important road in and out of London, faster and smoother than any track. Barges come and go at all hours. The building is brick, red brick, with large windows, because glass had become a way of announcing wealth, and the king was not shy about announcing wealth. There are gardens, an orchard, a tilt yard for tournaments, kennels, stables, a chapel, a great hall, and a warren of lodgings ranged around courtyards, each set of rooms allocated by rank to whoever was fortunate enough to have been allocated them. Inside, the court is not one household, but 2 joined at the hip. The king has his side, with his chamber, his privy chamber, his gentlemen, his grooms, his officers. The queen has hers, smaller, but built on exactly the same plan. Her side has its own chamberlain, its own vice-chamberlain, its own officers, and its own women, arranged from the great ladies at the top, down through gentlewomen, maids of honour, and chamberers, each with a defined function and a defined distance from the Queen's person. You are one of those women. We will get to your exact position in a few minutes. What I want you to hold in your mind before we begin is the sheer number of people. This was not a small, elegant household of 30. Depending on the season and who was in attendance, the court could number well over 1,000 people, and every single one of them had to be fed twice a day, given somewhere to sleep, and supplied with light and heat in the middle of an English winter. There were bakers, brewers, poulterers, scullions, laundresses, grooms, clerks, minstrels, chaplains, apothecaries, and men whose entire job was the accounting of spice. The building you are about to wake in is, functionally, a small town that has been organized around the daily maintenance of two people's bodies and reputations. And you are part of the machinery, a well-born, well-dressed, carefully educated piece of the machinery, but machinery all the same. There is one more thing worth saying now, because it will hang over everything that follows. Your skill was genuine. The needlework, the languages, the music, the memory for names and faces and precedents, the ability to stand for 3 hours without visible discomfort, the far more difficult ability to hear something dangerous and let your face do nothing at all. These were real competencies, learned over years, and the women who had them were valued for having them. But almost none of it was credited to them as skill. It was called grace. It was called breeding. It was called being well brought up. The labor was renamed as a quality of character. And once labor is renamed as character, nobody has to pay for it properly. And nobody has to thank you. Keep that in the back of your mind as the day unfolds. We will come back to it at the end. For now, let the room go quiet around you. Let the sounds of your own century fade out. It is a very cold Thursday morning in January, in the year 1535, and somewhere below you in the dark a servant is already breaking the ice on a water butt in the courtyard, because the household has to be awake long before the people it serves. Let us go back. You wake because someone else moves. That is how waking works here. Not a bell, not a knock, not light at a window. The woman beside you shifts her weight, drags a share of the blanket with her, and the cold gets in along your spine. And you are awake. It is somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning. There is no clock in this room to tell you which, and if there were, you would not be able to read it, because there is no light. Hold still for a moment before you move. This is a good moment to take inventory of where you are, because the room will tell you a great deal about your position if you let it. You are lying in a bed that is not yours. It is a decent bed, a proper joined bedstead with a rope and straw mattress, and a feather bed laid over it, hung with curtains of worsted wool that have been pulled shut against the draught. You share it with another gentlewoman. On the other side of the chamber, there is a second bed with 2 more, and on the floor between them, a truckle bed pulled out at night and pushed away by day, where a chamberer sleeps. 5 women, 1 room. The room is perhaps 16 feet by 12. There is a chest at the foot of each bed, and a single joint stool and nothing else, because there is no space for anything else. The palace is at Greenwich, on the south bank of the river, a few miles downstream of London. It was rebuilt and extended by the king's father, and it is one of the favoured winter houses, because it is close enough to the city for business, and far enough from it for air, and because the river runs right past the Watergate, which means the whole court can arrive and depart by barge, instead of dragging itself along roads that, in January, are not really roads at all. Breathe in. That is the smell of the place. Wood smoke, first and strongest, from 100 chimneys, some of them drawing badly. Under it, damp plaster and cold stone, which is a particular smell that people who have only lived in modern buildings have never had a name for. Under that, the river, which at low tide on a cold morning smells of mud and salt and other things. Somewhere further off, the smell of the stables, which is never absent from any royal house anywhere, because a court on the move requires several hundred horses, and horses are not tidy. And it is cold. Genuinely, seriously cold, in a way that is difficult to convey to anyone who has slept their whole life in a heated house. The fire in your chamber, if there was one at all, went out hours ago. Your breath is visible. The water in the ewer on the chest has a skin of ice on it. The stone of the wall, 6 inches from your face, is drawing warmth out of you steadily. All night, every night, from the middle of October until the end of March. Now, who are you? You are 24 years old. You are a gentlewoman of the Queen's Privy Chamber, which is a formal post with a formal fee attached to it, and you have held it for 2 years and some months. Before that, you spent 4 years in the household of a countess in the West Country, which is how these things are done. A girl of good family is placed in a household above her own, where she learns the manners, the languages, the music, the needle, and above all the enormous unwritten code of who bows to whom, and when, and how deeply. That placement is an education and an audition at once, and you passed it, and the Countess wrote to a cousin, and the cousin spoke to someone with access. And here you are. Your father is a knight with lands in Kent. Not a great magnate. Not a man whose name appears in chronicles. He holds 3 manors, perhaps 4, depending on how a disputed piece of marsh is eventually settled, and his income from them is somewhere in the region of £150 a year. That places him solidly among the county gentry. He sits as a justice of the peace. He is expected to raise men if the county is called upon. He is the most important person in his village, and a very minor person indeed in his shire. He has 5 surviving children, and you are the second daughter. That last fact is the one that shapes everything. An eldest son inherits. A second daughter has to be placed. And placing a second daughter means finding a marriage. And finding a marriage means finding a man of suitable rank, whose family will accept the portion your father can afford, which for you is somewhere around 200 marks. Call it £130, paid in instalments, and the instalments are already causing arguments. There is a marriage under negotiation for you. It has been under negotiation, in various forms, with various families, since you were 15. The current candidate is the second son of a Sussex family, with a good name and an indifferent estate. Letters have gone back and forth. Nothing is signed. It may happen this year, or it may collapse the way the 2 previous arrangements collapsed, over money in one case and over a lawsuit in the other. You are not consulted so much as informed. You are, however, allowed to have opinions, and your opinions are listened to more carefully than they would be if you were not standing every day within arm's reach of the Queen of England. Which brings us to what you actually earn. Your fee as a gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber is a little over £30 a year, paid quarterly, and it is paid late, roughly as often as it is paid on time. Attached to it is your bouge of court, which is your entitlement to be fed and lit and warmed at the king's expense. A set allowance of bread, ale, meat, candles, wood or coal, and a place to sleep. The allowance is specified in writing, in the ordinances that govern the household, down to the number of loaves and the number of candle ends. It is not generous. It is not meant to be generous. It is meant to be exact, because a household of this size collapses immediately without exact accounting. £30 a year is a real sum. A skilled craftsman in London, a joiner, a mason, might earn £8 or £9 in a good year of steady work. A country curate might have less than that. A labourer, a great deal less. By any ordinary measure, you are well paid. You are also almost certainly losing money. We will come back to that properly in a little while, because it deserves proper attention, and because it is the single fact that most reliably surprises people about the position you occupy. For now, simply note it and let it sit. The post pays you £30 a year, and it costs your family considerably more than £30 a year to keep you in it. Now move. You have to, eventually. The trick is to do it without waking the woman beside you, who has another quarter of an hour before she must rise, and who is not gracious about being disturbed. You slide out along the edge of the bed, and the cold takes you completely, and for a second or two your whole body objects. You find the floor with your feet. The rushes on the boards have been down a while, and they are not clean, but they are marginally warmer than bare wood. There is one rushlight burning in a holder on the chest, a length of dried rush dipped in kitchen fat, giving out about as much light as a single candle flame and rather more smell. You light a second from it, because you will need to see to dress, and because the passages between here and the Queen's lodgings will be almost entirely dark for another 2 hours. Listen for a moment while you stand there. Below you, the household is already at work, and has been for some time. There is the sound of a door somewhere in the courtyard, and the sound of feet on cobbles. There is a rhythmic knocking that is someone splitting kindling. There is the low grinding of a cart wheel. Deliveries come early, and in January they come in the dark. Further off, faintly, a dog. The kitchens have had fires lit since 3, because the ovens take hours to reach the heat that bread requires, and the household expects to eat at the usual hour, whether the weather cooperates or not. Nobody down there will ever be named in any record. The man breaking ice on the water butt, the boy carrying kindling, the woman starting the ovens. They are the foundation the entire visible court stands on, and they have already been awake for an hour before you opened your eyes. Above you, on the floor where the Queen's lodgings are, there is nothing yet. Silence. That silence is deliberate, and it is protected. The Queen will be woken at the hour appointed, by the people appointed, and not 1 minute earlier. Your job today, in the plainest possible terms, is this. You will dress in the dark, in the cold, with help, because you cannot do it alone. You will walk to the Queen's lodgings, and take your place in the order of women who wait upon her rising. You will attend her to prayer. You will stand behind her while she conducts business she is not permitted to conduct in her own name. You will eat when there is a gap. You will sit with a needle in your hand for several hours, and you will not be idle for a moment of it. You will attend her at the great meal of the day, and again in the afternoon, and again at supper. And afterwards you will dance in front of the entire court, a set of figures you have practiced since childhood, and you will do it as though it costs you nothing. And then, late, when the last candle in her chamber has been carried out, and the curtains of her bed have been drawn closed, you will walk back down these same cold passages, and someone will unpin you, and you will get into that bed beside a woman who is already asleep, and it will start again. That is the day. Let us begin it properly, with the water in the ewer, and the ice on top of it. Before the water, though, there is something worth settling, because it shapes everything that follows, and most retellings of this world get it precisely backwards. The polite fiction of the court is that you are here as an honor. That is the language everyone uses. You have been received into the Queen's service. You have been placed about her person. A gentlewoman of good family has been graciously admitted to attend upon her grace. Every word of that phrasing is designed to make what you do sound like a gift given upward, a form of devotion, something closer to worship than to work. Nobody at Greenwich would describe you as employed. Nobody would say you have a job. And yet you have a fee paid quarterly out of the Queen's own coffers. You have a livery. You have a defined allowance of food and drink and firewood and candles, calculated by clerks and written into a book. You have hours, in the sense that there are times of day when your absence would be noticed and reported. You have a superior, and she has a superior above her, and there is a written order of who does what and in what sequence, and when that order is broken, there is trouble about it. Strip away the vocabulary of honor, and what remains is a post. A salaried position with duties, entitlements, a hierarchy, and a set of skills you had to acquire before anyone would consider you for it. This is the first and largest correction to make. The women around a Tudor queen were not decoration that happened to be alive. They were the working staff of the most closely watched household in England. And the reason the honor language exists at all is that admitting the truth would have been unbearable to everyone involved. A gentleman does not send his daughter into service. He places her at court. The distinction is entirely in the phrasing and entirely necessary to maintain. So let us look at the numbers underneath the phrasing, because the numbers are unromantic, and they are also where the real story lives. The Queen's female household was not one undifferentiated cloud of ladies. It was a graded structure, and each grade had a different name, a different level of access, and a different rate of pay. At the top sat the great ladies, women of the highest birth, countesses and duchesses, and the wives of the men who governed the realm. Their attendance was intermittent rather than daily. They came to court for the great feasts, for the ceremonial occasions, for the moments when the Queen needed to be seen surrounded by the first rank of the kingdom. And then they went home to their own estates and their own households, which were substantial and required governing. Their reward was rarely a wage in any meaningful sense. What they received was position, and position converted into other things later. Below them sat the women who actually did the work, day in and day out, and this is where you are. Gentlewomen of the Privy Chamber. Women of good but not spectacular family, competent, trained, present every morning. Below you again, in a category that carried a particular shine, were the maids of honour, younger and unmarried, kept about the Queen partly for the pleasantness of the arrangement, and very substantially because a place among them was the finest marriage market in England, and below all of them were the chamberers, who cleaned, and beyond the chamber entirely were the laundresses and the women of the lesser offices, who were paid less, seen less, and whose names survive in the accounts more often than in the chronicles. As to the money, a maid of honour might expect something in the region of £10 a year, sometimes a little more, together with her lodging and her board. A gentlewoman of your standing might have £20, or thereabouts, and the figure varied with favour and with length of service. These sums sound small, and in one sense they were not. £20 a year in the 1530s was a serious income. A skilled craftsman in London, a joiner or a mason working steadily, might earn something like £8 or £9 in a year of full employment. A country curate could be living on less than that. A labourer in the fields, paid by the day, would not come close. Measured against the working population of England, you are extremely well paid. Measured against what the post actually costs you, you are losing money, and everyone in your family knows it. Here is the arithmetic that keeps fathers awake. You cannot appear at court in the clothes you wore at home in Kent. The standard is set by the Queen, and the standard does not bend. You need gowns, and a court gown is not a garment so much as a small architectural project, requiring yards of velvet or satin or damask, silk lining, buckram to hold the shape, silk thread, and often fur at the collar and cuffs. Velvet of decent quality might run to £1 the yard, and a gown will consume many yards. Add the sleeves, which are separate and interchangeable, and expected to be varied. Add the kirtle beneath. Add the French hood, which is wired and covered and edged, and is the single most conspicuous object on your body. A single respectable gown can cost more than a maid of honour's entire annual fee, and you cannot own only one. Then there is the horse, because the court moves, and you must move with it, and a woman of your rank does not walk. Then there is the saddle and the harness. Then there is the servant, because you are attending a queen all day, and you cannot also be mending your own hems and washing your own linen. So you keep a woman of your own, and you pay her, and you feed her out of your allowance. Then there is the chest, and the carriage of the chest, and the tips. The tips are their own quiet catastrophe. A court runs on small payments handed sideways. The man who brings you a message expects something. The servant who carries a gift into the chamber expects something. At the great feasts and at the New Year, money moves downward in a constant fine drizzle, and you are expected to be part of the weather. A woman who is known to be close-fisted acquires a reputation faster than a woman who is known to be badly dressed. Set the £20 against all of that, and the result is straightforward. Most families subsidized a daughter at court, sometimes heavily, out of rents from land that was working perfectly well without any assistance from the royal household. Fathers wrote letters about it. Brothers complained. The expense was real, and it was ongoing, and it did not stop when you were established, because being established raised the standard rather than lowering it. Which raises the obvious question. If a place at court costs a family more than it pays, why did every gentry family in England spend years scheming, petitioning, and calling in favours to get one. Because the fee was never the point. The fee was the smallest and least interesting part of what a place at court was worth. What you have, standing in that chamber every morning, is proximity. You are within a few feet of the person closest to the king. You hear things days before they are written down, and weeks before they reach Kent. And more importantly, you are visible to the people who hold the giving of things. England in the 1530s ran on patronage. Almost nothing worth having was bought on an open market. Offices were given. Wardships, meaning the profitable guardianship of an heir whose father had died, were given. Leases of crown land were given. Licenses, pardons, appointments to a customs post, or a stewardship, or a place in a cathedral chapter, all given, and all given by somebody who had to be asked by somebody they were willing to listen to. Your family's ambitions are not achieved by merit, and they are not achieved by application. They are achieved by knowing a person who can mention a name at the right moment in the right room. You are that person. You are your family's hand inside the room. Your brother wants a place in the household of a great lord. Your uncle would like the lease of a manor that has fallen to the crown. Your cousin is in a lawsuit and would benefit enormously from a word spoken in his favor. None of these things will be granted because they are just. They will be granted, if they are granted, because a request was carried by somebody trusted, at a moment when the person asked was inclined to be generous, and you are the one standing there measuring that inclination, hour by hour. And there is the marriage. A woman who has served a queen is worth more, in the frank language of the marriage negotiation, than a woman who has not. She has been seen. She has been vouched for. She has connections that will outlast her service, and her children will inherit those connections. A settlement made for a court-served daughter is a better settlement, and everybody at the table understands why. So the family pays. It pays for the gowns, and the horse, and the woman who mends your linen, and it counts the cost, and it grumbles, and it keeps paying, because the alternative is being absent from the only room in England where things are decided. The £20 a year is not your salary. The £20 is a rebate against an investment, and the return, if it comes at all, will arrive years later in the form of an office your brother holds, a manor your family leases, and a husband whose name is better than the one you would otherwise have had. That is what you are, lying in the dark under 3 blankets in a shared bed, listening to the palace wake. Not an ornament, an asset, carefully placed, expensively maintained, and expected to earn. Below you now there is more noise. A door somewhere in the range beneath, and boots on stone, and a voice raised briefly, and then hushed. The candle-bearers are moving through the outer chambers. Somewhere a shutter is opened, and the January cold comes through it, and finds its way, eventually, under your door. Your bedfellow has stopped breathing evenly. She is awake, and she knows you are awake, and neither of you has yet been willing to be the first to move. The water in the ewer is waiting, and it will not get any warmer. So one of you moves. It is you, because your bedfellow has seniority by 2 years of service, and the unspoken arithmetic of a shared bed always favours the one who has been in it longer. You put your feet onto the floor, and the cold comes up through the rushes and into you at once, and you say something under your breath that is not quite a prayer. The room is not dark exactly. There is a rushlight burning down in its holder, a length of dried rush soaked in kitchen fat, which gives off a small, unsteady flame and a smell that is honestly closer to a fried supper than to anything devotional. It costs almost nothing, which is why it is what burns in a waiting woman's chamber overnight rather than a wax candle. Wax is for the Queen's rooms. Tallow is for the household. Rushlight is for you. You wash first, and this is the shortest part of the morning by a considerable margin. There is a shallow basin, a ewer of water carried up the night before, and now cold enough to make your hands ache, and a square of linen. You wash your face, your hands, your wrists, your neck. You do not wash the rest of you, and neither does anyone else in the building, including the Queen, including the King. Linen is the answer to that problem. Linen worn next to the body absorbs sweat and oil, and linen is washed constantly. And cleanliness in this century is measured largely by how white the collar and cuffs are that show at the edges of your clothing. A woman with brilliant linen is a clean woman. What is happening underneath the wool is nobody's concern, because the wool never touches her. Which brings you to the smock, and the smock is where the whole architecture begins. Here is something worth slowing down for, because the popular image of Tudor dress imagines it as a dress, a single garment pulled over the head, and it was nothing of the sort. What you are about to put on is not a dress. It is a system of separate pieces, layered in a fixed order, each doing a specific structural job, most of them not fastened to your body at all, but pinned or laced to each other. First the smock. Fine white linen, cut wide, falling to about the knee, gathered at the neck and wrists with small embroidered bands. It is the only garment you own that will be washed this week. It is also the only garment that will touch your skin all day. Over the smock, the kirtle. This is the working layer, and it is the one that does the shaping. The bodice of it is stiffened, the front cut to a point, and it laces closed. And when it is laced properly, the effect is not the pinched hourglass of 3 centuries later, but a smooth, flat, conical front, like the front of a well-made box. The Tudor ideal is not curve. The Tudor ideal is a torso with no visible seams and no visible softness, a plain geometric front on which the jewelry and the embroidery can be displayed without interruption. You are, in a very literal sense, being made into a surface. The kirtle skirt hangs from that bodice, and is the skirt that will be seen, because the gown that goes over it opens in a wide inverted V at the front to reveal it. That means the kirtle skirt is made of the better cloth. This is the first of many small economies you will make today. The fabric that shows is expensive, and the fabric that does not show is cheap. The back panels of your kirtle skirt are plain worsted. The front panel is figured silk. Nobody will ever see the back, and everybody will see the front. And this is not considered a deception. Everybody at court does it. Everybody at court knows everybody does it. Then the gown. The gown goes over everything, opens at the front, and is furred or faced at the collar and hem, depending on your rank and the season. And in January, it is furred. It is heavy. All of it together, smock and kirtle and gown, and the underskirt beneath, comes to something in the region of 15 to 20 pounds of cloth, carried on your body from before dawn until after supper. You have long since stopped noticing the weight the way you noticed it in the first month, but you notice it on stairs, and you notice it when you have been standing for 2 hours, and you will notice it tonight. And then the sleeves, which are not attached to anything. Tudor sleeves are separate objects. They arrive as a pair. They are pinned or tied into the armholes of the gown, and they can be changed independently of everything else. A woman with 3 gowns and 6 pairs of sleeves has, to any observer, rather more than 3 outfits. This is exactly why sleeves are made the way they are. They are the cheapest way to appear to own more clothing than you do, and they are the part of the wardrobe most often given as a gift, because a pair of sleeves is a garment that requires no fitting and cannot be the wrong size. Nothing about this fastens at the front, and nothing about it fastens by any means you can reach behind your own back. The lacing of the kirtle runs where your fingers cannot manage the tension. The pins that hold the sleeves need to go in at an angle you cannot see. There are, on an ordinary morning, somewhere between 20 and 40 straight pins holding your clothing together, and every single one of them was made by hand, drawn and cut, and headed by a pinner. And they are valuable enough that you count them out at night, and count them back into their small box, and are genuinely annoyed when one goes missing in the rushes. So you dress each other. This is simply the fact of it. 2 of you working on one, then swapping, the way it is done in every chamber in the palace from the Queen's downward. There is no possible version of this clothing that a woman puts on alone, and the clothing is designed by people who knew perfectly well that she would not have to. The garment assumes the servant. The garment assumes the sister, the bedfellow, the waiting woman. Independence was never the point, and the ability to dress oneself was not a virtue anyone was trying to build into the design. Your bedfellow laces you, and you feel the bodice tighten by degrees and settle, and then you turn and do the same for her. And the work of it takes the 2 of you together the better part of half an hour, which is quick. On a day with a great ceremony, it will take twice that. Last, the head. Your hair is parted, combed, plaited, and coiled and pinned flat, and over it goes a linen coif, and over that goes the French hood. The French hood is a crescent, wired and stiffened, set back on the head so that a band of the front hair shows, with a fall of black cloth behind. It is fashionable at this precise moment in a way it will not be in 20 years, and it is fashionable in part because the Queen wears it, and what the Queen wears is what the Queen's women wear, adjusted downward in quality so that no one outshines her. That adjustment is not written down anywhere. It does not need to be, but some of it is written down, and this is worth a detour, because there were laws about your clothing. They were called sumptuary laws, and England had them repeatedly across this century, and their purpose was to make rank legible on sight. A statute would set out, in flat administrative language, which materials and colours belonged to which degree of person. Cloth of gold and purple silk were reserved to the royal family, and, in some formulations, to a very narrow band of the highest nobility. Sable was restricted to the top of the peerage. Velvet in certain colours, satin, damask, silk of particular kinds. Each was pegged to a rank or an income threshold. and below that threshold you were forbidden to wear it. The furs were graded in the same way, down from sable and ermine through marten and lynx to the fox and lamb and rabbit that everyone else could wear. And rabbit could be worn by nearly anybody. You are the daughter of a knightly family holding a post in the Queen's chamber, and that places you in a middling band. You may wear velvet in most colours. You may not wear cloth of gold. You may wear a fur trim of marten if your father's income supports it and your husband's standing permits it. And the wording of the statute leaves enough ambiguity that a determined family will read it generously. What happened when a woman dressed above her station? In law, a fine, sometimes a forfeiture of the garment itself. In practice, prosecutions were rare, and the statutes were enforced unevenly at best, and reformers complained endlessly that nobody obeyed them. But the enforcement that mattered was never the courts. It was the room. Wear a fur that everyone present knows is beyond your degree, and nobody finds you. They simply look and mention it to each other later, and the mention travels, and you have announced that your family is reaching. Reaching is not a crime. It is merely something everybody now knows about you. So you dress carefully, and you dress correctly, and you dress in something that is very fine and just fractionally less fine than it might be, because the safest place to stand in this household is one small step below the highest position you could plausibly claim. Your bedfellow pins the hood, adjusts it, steps back, and moves it half an inch, and the half inch matters to both of you. There is a last inspection of each other in the grey light, the smoothing of a sleeve, the tucking of a stray edge of linen. Then the door, and the passage, and the cold. The passages at Greenwich in January are stone, and they hold the night's cold like a cellar, and your breath goes ahead of you in the rushlight as you walk. Somewhere down the range, a door opens and closes. There are others moving now, in twos, all going the same way, all dressed by somebody else's hands. You turn toward the Queen's lodgings, and you are not late, and you make quite sure of that every single morning of your life. The door to the Queen's outer chamber is already open, and there is already a fire in it, which means somebody has been awake considerably longer than you have. The grooms of the chamber laid that fire in the dark, swept the hearth, carried the fuel, and withdrew before any woman of rank arrived. You will not see them again until tonight. Their work is arranged so as to be invisible, and yours, in a slightly higher key, is arranged the same way. You take your place with the others in the outer chamber, and you wait. Waiting is the largest single component of the job. Nobody warns you about this beforehand, and no household book records it, because it produces nothing that can be written down. There is a phrase used for women in your position, waiting woman, and it is exact in a way that people who use it casually never quite notice. The rising of a queen is not a private act performed in a private room. It is a sequence, and the sequence has an order, and the order is the whole point. First, the bed curtains are drawn back, and this is done by a great lady, one of the very highest women of the household, a countess or a marchioness, a woman with lands of her own, and a husband who sits in the Lords. She does not do it because it is difficult. A child could draw a curtain. She does it because drawing it is the most privileged small action available in the room. and privilege is the currency that the entire court runs on. The right to perform a trivial task first, and in view of others, is worth more than money, because money can be earned, and this cannot. Then comes water. Somebody has heated it somewhere below, and somebody else has carried it up, and neither of those people will enter this chamber. It arrives at the door in a covered vessel, and is received by a woman of middling rank, who carries it the last 12 feet. That final 12 feet is the part that counts. A basin is held. A cloth is offered. The offering is done kneeling, and the kneeling is not a gesture of humility, so much as a matter of height, because the queen is seated, and it is not permitted to stand over her. Then the smock is changed, and here the room narrows to the very smallest number of people. The linen next to a queen's body is handled by a short list of women and by nobody else, and the list is short for reasons that are partly about honor and partly about something more practical, which is that the person nearest the body is the person best placed to know things. What a queen eats, how she sleeps, whether she is well, whether she is tired, whether she has been weeping. Every one of those facts has a value outside the room, so the door is kept narrow, and the women who pass through it are chosen with enormous care, and their families know precisely what they have gained. Then the layers, in order, in the same order you were dressed in an hour ago, only slower, and with 4 pairs of hands instead of 1, and with 100 weight more silk. Then the jewels, brought in a locked case by the woman who keeps the key, checked against a list, fastened, and the case locked again. Then the hood, and the hood is the last thing, and after the hood is set, the queen is finished, and the room releases its held breath and begins to talk. Your own part in all of this, stated plainly, is small. You hold, you carry, you kneel, you stand still for long stretches, in a heavy gown, in a cold room, holding an object that weighs almost nothing, waiting to be asked for it. You hand a comb to the woman who hands it onward. You take away the used linen and pass it to the chamberer at the door. Once, perhaps, in a whole morning, the queen speaks to you directly, and you answer briefly and well, and that exchange is worth repeating to your family in your next letter home. This is worth slowing down for, because the layering of the household is easy to flatten in the imagination into one undifferentiated crowd of ladies, and it was nothing of the kind. At the top were the great ladies, married women of the highest rank, often considerably older than you, attending when they chose to attend, and departing to their own estates when they did not. Their presence at court was itself the honor, and their duties were mostly ceremonial, and mostly performed at the most visible moments. Below them, the gentlewomen of the privy chamber, which is where you sit. Salaried, resident, present every day, doing the actual sustained work of attendance. Below that, the maids of honor, unmarried, younger than you, sent to court expressly to be seen, educated, and married off well, with a mother of the maids set over them to keep the arrangement respectable. And below all of those, the chamberers. The chamberers are the ones nobody puts in the paintings. They make the bed. They carry the fuel and the water to the door. They sweep, they tidy, they set the room right after the ceremony that everyone else has just performed in it. They are women of the household, paid rather less than you. and their work is the work that would be most immediately missed if it stopped. Below them again, entirely outside the chamber, the laundresses who handle the Queen's linen once it has left the room, and who are paid for it separately, and who never come further up the stairs than the bottom of them. Notice what the hierarchy is actually organized around. It is not organized around skill, and it is not organized around effort. It is organized around proximity and around touch. Who may be in the room, who may be near the bed, who may put a hand on the Queen's person, and who may only put a hand on an object that will shortly touch the Queen's person, and who may only handle that object after it has ceased to touch her. Each of those is a separate rank, and each is defended, and women have wept over the difference between one and the next. The chamber itself enforces this, because the lodgings of a Tudor queen are built as a sequence of rooms, each one smaller and quieter than the one before, with a door between each. First, the great chamber, where a great many people may come. Then the presence chamber, with the chair of estate under its canopy, where the Queen sits in public, and where a person of decent rank might be brought to be presented. Then the privy chamber, which is private in the specific sense that admission is controlled, and where the household's real business is done. Then the bedchamber, and beyond that the closets, the small rooms for prayer and for keeping things. To walk from the outermost door to the innermost is to pass through 4 or 5 separate thresholds, and at each one somebody has the authority to stop you. A man of considerable importance in the country at large may get no further than the second door. You go through all of them every morning without being challenged, because the ushers know your face. That fact, and nothing else, is what your family paid for, which brings up something that sits oddly with a modern mind, and it is the strange doubleness of your relationship with the woman you serve. You are physically closer to the Queen than almost anyone in England. You know how she takes her ale in the morning. You know which sleeve she dislikes and never wears. You know the sound of her breathing when she is tired, and the particular flat tone in her voice that means she has slept badly and would prefer not to be spoken to before she has eaten. You will spend more waking hours in her company this year than her own mother did in a decade. You will stand beside her in circumstances of complete informality, and she will occasionally say something to you that she would say to nobody at all outside this room. And you are not her friend, and you will never be her equal. And both of you know this with perfect clarity at every moment. This is not coldness on her side. It is the structure. Intimacy and deference are not opposites here. They are made to operate together, and the court is extremely good at running them at the same time. You may hold her sleeve, and you may not sit in her presence without leave. She may confide in you, and she may dismiss you tomorrow without explanation and without recourse. She may show you kindness that is entirely genuine, and the kindness does not alter the arrangement by a hair. What makes it workable, and it is workable, is that you were raised inside it, and it does not feel like a contradiction to you. You have known since you were 7 years old how to be near a great person without presuming. It is a skill, and it is taught mostly by watching. When to speak, how far to lower your eyes, how to be present in a room without occupying any space in it, how to overhear something without any part of your face acknowledging that you have heard it. That last one is the hardest and the most valuable, and you are good at it, and you were not good at it in your first year, and you can remember the exact morning you learned better. The jewels are fastened. The hood is set. Somebody kneels to arrange the hem of the train and rises again. There is a small pause in which nothing at all happens, and every woman in the room takes half a step backward without any signal being given. And the Queen stands. The room reorders itself around her instantly. The great ladies to the front, the gentlewomen behind, the maids behind them. All of it done in perhaps 4 seconds and without a word spoken. And if a stranger were standing at the door, he would think it happened by itself. It does not happen by itself. It is the second piece of skilled work you have completed today, and it is not yet 7 in the morning, and there is a bell beginning somewhere out beyond the windows, which means the chapel and the day proper, and the long walk down the gallery in a line. The gallery at Greenwich runs long and cold along the riverside of the palace, and at this hour it is the coldest room you will pass through all day, because it has windows on both sides and nothing in it to hold warmth. You walk in the order you always walk in, which is not the order of friendship but the order of birth. And the woman ahead of you has a father with a barony, and the woman behind you has a father with more money and no title at all, and both of those facts are settled, and neither of them is discussed. Your breath shows. The floor is matting laid over stone, and the matting has been trodden flat, and smells faintly of the river when the damp gets into it. Through the windows on the left, the Thames is the colour of pewter, and there is already traffic on it. Wherries, and a barge going down with the tide, because the river is the road, and it does not wait for anyone to be awake. You are going to the chapel. You go to the chapel every morning of your life, and you have gone every morning since you were a child in Kent, and the going is so habitual that you could do it half asleep, and on a fair number of mornings you effectively have. The Queen does not sit among the congregation. She hears Mass from a closet, which is a small enclosed room set above the body of the chapel, and opening onto it through a window or a grille, so that she can see the altar and be seen only partly. Her women are with her, or as many of them as the room will hold, and the rest stand below. Today you are above, which is a small mark of where you currently stand, and you are aware of it, and you would not say so. The closet is not warm either, but it is warmer than the gallery, because it is small, and there are 8 bodies in it, and a brazier somewhere near the door. There are cushions to kneel on, embroidered, worn thin at the centre, where knees have gone for years. The smell is candle wax, and a little incense, and the particular smell of very old wool hangings that have never been washed, and never will be. Below, the priest begins. You know every word of it. You have known every word of it since before you could read, and the words are in Latin, and you understand rather more of that Latin than most people would assume, because you were taught, but you would not claim fluency, and nobody has ever asked you to. Here is something worth slowing down for, because it shapes everything about how your day is built. You do not have a clock. Almost nobody does. There are mechanical clocks in the world in the 1530s, and there is very likely one somewhere in this palace, in a turret or a great chamber. And the king owns portable timepieces because he owns most things that are new and expensive. But you do not own one, and you have never carried one, and neither has anyone you grew up with. What you have instead is bells. The day is measured out by the offices of the church, which have been ringing across every parish and every religious house in the kingdom for centuries, and which everybody hears whether or not they attend. Matins and lauds in the deep dark, prime near dawn, terce in the mid-morning, sext at midday, none in the middle of the afternoon, vespers at dusk, compline before sleep. 8 of them. They divide the light into pieces, and because the pieces are tied to sunrise and sunset, rather than to a fixed count of minutes, they stretch and shrink with the season. A summer hour is genuinely longer than a winter hour. Nobody finds this confusing, because nobody is trying to measure anything smaller than a bell. When somebody at this court says they will meet you after dinner, they do not mean at 1:15. They mean after dinner, which is a real and shared and perfectly precise piece of information, and which will be a different position of the sun in January than it is in June. Time here is a set of landmarks rather than a ruler. You will live your entire life without once knowing what minute it is, and you will never feel the lack. The other thing you have instead of a clock is a book. You are holding it now. It is a primer, which is the ordinary word for a book of hours, and it is the single most common book in England, and probably the most common object of any kind that a woman of your rank owns after her clothes. It is small. It fits in one hand. Yours was your mother's, and her name is written on the flyleaf in a hand that slopes hard to the right, and below it, in a different ink, somebody has recorded the birth of her 3rd child and the fact that the child lived. And below that, in your own careful writing, there is nothing yet, because you have not married, and there is nothing yet to record. The book contains the hours of the Virgin, the Psalms, the office of the dead, a calendar of saints with the great feasts marked in red, and a handful of prayers in English at the back that somebody has added. There are pictures. Yours has 11 of them, painted small, one at the beginning of each hour, and the gold on them still catches when the light moves. It cost your mother's family a sum that would have bought a good horse, and it is treated accordingly, wrapped in a square of silk when it is not being carried. A primer is a devotional object, and it is entirely genuine as one. You use it. The words in it are the words you say when you are frightened or when you cannot sleep. But it is also, without any contradiction, a statement of what your family can afford, and a thing to be seen holding, and eventually a thing to be left in a will, with the recipient named by hand. Devotion and display are not separate categories here. A woman kneeling with a fine primer is doing both at once, and everyone in the room understands this, and nobody thinks less of her for it. The Queen's own books are finer than yours by a considerable distance, and there are more of them, and some are in French. You have seen her reading in French in the afternoon, with no ceremony about it at all. The way another woman might pick up sewing, the mass moves through its parts below. There is the small movement of the elevation, and the whole room goes down, and there is the sound 8 women make, kneeling at once on cushions, which is a sound like a book being closed. Then quiet, then it starts again. Now a careful word about the weather of this particular decade, because it would be dishonest to walk you through a chapel in the year 1535 and say nothing about it. The religious ground is moving under your feet. It has been moving for several years. Parliament has passed acts which most people in this room could not summarize accurately, and which have nonetheless changed who stands at the head of the church in this kingdom. There are men at this court who read new books, and men at this court who consider those books an error. There are households in the country still doing exactly what they did in 1490. And there are households where the talk at supper is of scripture in English, and what a person may read for herself. What matters for you, kneeling on a worn cushion in a closet above the chapel, is this: you have opinions, and you do not air them. Not because you are frightened every hour of every day. That is not what it feels like. It feels more like weather, something large and outside you, and not yours to argue with. And the sensible response to weather is to dress for it and go about your business. So you say the words you have always said, and you say them sincerely. And if the words alter somewhat in the years ahead, you will say those instead. You listen when other women talk, and you notice which ones talk freely and which do not. And you file that away with everything else you notice, and you say very little yourself. And what you do say is agreeable and unmemorable. It is the same skill as the one you use at the Queen's bedside, applied to a different subject. Be present. Occupy no space. There will be a great deal written later about what people in this decade believed. Almost none of it will be written by a woman standing where you are standing, holding her mother's primer, keeping her face still. The Mass ends. There is a moment where nothing happens, which is the same moment that happens at the end of every ceremony in this palace. A small held pause before the ordering begins. Then the Queen rises, and everybody rises, and the cushions are gathered by somebody whose job that is. And you wrap your book in its silk, and put it into the pocket hanging at your waist under the gown, and your knees hurt in the particular way that stone floors and thin cushions produce. Going back along the gallery is different from coming. The palace has woken up while you were in the chapel. There are men in the gallery now, in twos and threes, standing at the windows with their heads together. And some of them bow as the Queen passes, and some of them stop talking as she passes and start again after. And one of them catches the eye of the woman ahead of you for exactly as long as is permissible and no longer. Somewhere below, a door bangs, and a voice shouts something about a barge. There is smoke coming up from the kitchen court, a great deal of it, which means the fires have been going for hours, and dinner is already well advanced, even though it is early. A dog goes past at speed with nobody following it. Two grooms carry a chest between them, with the strain showing, and stand aside against the wall with their heads down while the Queen's party goes by, and pick the chest up again afterward without comment. The light through the windows has come up while you were inside. It is grey and low, and it is the most light this day is going to offer. And you register that fact the way you register the cold, which is to say, fully and without complaint. Ahead of you, the line turns left toward the Queen's lodgings, and you can smell bread. You can smell bread because the bakehouse at Greenwich has been at work since well before you woke. And because the passage that runs behind the Queen's lodgings shares a wall with the place where the bread comes up from the ovens on trays under cloths, it is the best smell in the palace, and it is not for you, not the fine white sort, or at least not much of it, but you get some, and you get it soon. Breakfast at this court is not a meal in the sense that you might imagine one. Nobody sits down to it. There is no table laid, no grace said, no order of dishes. It is a thing that happens in corners and passages, and in the corner of the presence chamber, where a cloth has been thrown over a chest. And it happens fast, because everybody eating has somewhere to be within the quarter hour. What you are handed is bread and ale. The bread is a manchet, a small, round, white loaf about the size of your two fists together, and it is warm, which is the whole pleasure of the morning. The ale comes in a wooden cup, and it is weak, the second brewing, the kind that a household makes precisely so that people can drink it all day without falling over. With it this morning, there is cold beef from yesterday's dinner, sliced thin, and a little salt. On a fish day, it would be a piece of cold ling or a salt herring instead. And you would eat that too, standing, without much thinking about it. You eat it standing because you are a gentlewoman of the privy chamber, and there is nowhere for you to sit that would not be presumptuous. And because the woman who outranks you is also standing, and because in a very few minutes there will be people at the door of the Queen's chamber wanting things, you eat quickly, and you eat everything, including the crust, and you drink the ale down and hand the cup back to the boy who brought it, who is perhaps 12 and has been awake longer than you have. Here is the part that most people never think about, and it is worth slowing down for, because the scale of it is genuinely difficult to hold in the head. The household of King Henry VIII, taken all together, ran to something in the region of 1,000 people. In some years, and at some houses, it went higher. That is not 1,000 courtiers. That is 1,000 people who had a right to be fed by the king. And it included the great lords, and the gentlemen and the ladies. And it also included the cooks, the turnbroaches who turned the spits, the scullery boys, the yeomen of the guard, the grooms, the porters at every gate, the men who carried coal, the men who carried water, the laundresses, the falconers, the men who looked after the king's dogs, and the small army of servants that each important person brought with them, and who also had to eat. To feed 1,000 people twice a day, every day, in winter, in a house with no refrigeration, and no reliable way of moving anything faster than a cart or a barge, required a machine. And it was a machine, with departments and clerks, and written accounts, and a hierarchy as strict as anything in the chamber above. The kitchens themselves were divided. There was not one kitchen, but several. One for the king's own meat, another for the household at large, with a boiling house, a larder, a scalding house for poultry, a pastry with its own ovens, a saucery, and a confectionery. The bakehouse was separate and made 2 grades of bread, the fine white manchet for high tables and the coarser cheat loaf for everybody else. The brewhouse was separate again, and it was, by volume, the busiest place in any royal house in England. Then the serving departments. The pantry held bread. The buttery held ale and beer. The cellar held wine. The spicery held pepper and cinnamon and ginger and cloves and sugar. all of it under lock, all of it weighed out by the ounce against a written warrant, because a pound of any of those things was worth more than a labouring man earned in a week. The chandlery made and issued candles. The woodyard issued fuel. Each of these was run by a sergeant or a yeoman with a clerk under him, and each of them wrote down what went out and to whom. Consider what that means in a single morning. The bakehouse at a great house might turn out somewhere in the region of 1,000 loaves before dinner. The brewhouse produced ale by the barrel, and a barrel held about 32 gallons, and the household got through something like 100 barrels in a week, which is more than 3,000 gallons of ale, and in a full year the royal household's consumption of ale and beer ran into the hundreds of thousands of gallons. That is not a figure anybody has invented for effect. It is a figure that comes out of the accounts because somebody wrote it down at the time, in a ledger, so that somebody else could check it. The reason everybody drank ale rather than water was not that water was known to be dangerous in the way we would now understand. It was partly that Islay was food, thick and slightly sweet, and full of calories, and partly that river water in a town smelled of the town. Nobody thought about germs. Everybody thought about taste, and about the fact that a working man, given water instead of ale, would consider himself cheated. Now, the thing that concerns you personally in all of this. The word is bouge of court, which is a corruption of the French bouche, meaning mouth, and it is the technical term for your right to be fed. Every post in the household came with a stated allowance attached to it, and the allowance was written into the ordinances in almost unbelievable detail. Your bouge, as a gentlewoman of the Queen's privy chamber, entitles you to a stated quantity of bread and ale each day, a share of the meat and fish served at the tables where you eat, a measure of wine, and, in winter, a stated allowance of fuel and of candles. That last one matters more than a modern person expects. Candles were expensive. Wax candles were very expensive, and the cheaper sort, made of tallow, smelled of what they were made from and smoked, and even those were counted out and issued by the piece. A person of your rank might be allowed a certain number of tallow lights a night and 1 or 2 of wax, and the allowance changed with the season, more in December, less in June, because the ordinances were written by people who had done the arithmetic. Fuel was the same. So much wood, or so much charcoal, per chamber per night, from a stated date in autumn to a stated date in spring. When you go back to your chamber tonight and find the fire meagre, that is not neglect. That is the allowance, and somebody in the woodyard has already written down that it was issued. Set that against money, because money makes it real. Your fee for the post is paid in pounds a year, and it is not large, and you have already understood that it does not cover your gowns. But your bouge of court is worth something, and it is worth something specific. If you were not fed and lodged and warmed by the king, you would be buying it, and buying it was expensive. A barrel of ale, bought in, might cost in the region of 4 or 5 shillings. A pound of sugar, which came a very long way, and was still counted as a spice rather than a food, could cost a shilling or more, and there were times when it cost considerably more. Pepper the same, or dearer. A pound of cloves or of nutmeg was a luxury purchase, entered in accounts with the same care as a piece of plate. Meanwhile, a skilled craftsman in London, a carpenter or a mason at the top of his trade, might earn 6pence or so in a day, which is 30 pence in a working week, which is 2 shillings and 6pence. So a pound of sugar cost that man something like half a week's wages. A pound of good spice could cost him a week or more. Meanwhile, upstairs, the spicery is issuing those things by warrant into dishes that will be eaten by people who will not remark on them at all, because the whole point of a court is that expensive things appear without comment, and your annual fee, whatever it is, sits somewhere in this landscape and does not go very far in it, and the diet and the lodging and the fuel are, in cold arithmetic, worth more to you than the fee itself, which is why women of good family competed for these posts and did not consider themselves servants for taking them. You are not being paid a wage. You are being maintained. The boy who took your cup has gone. Somewhere behind you, one of the other women is still eating and doing it slowly on purpose, which is a small luxury and a small statement, and nobody says anything about it. Through the door of the presence chamber, you can hear the sound changing. It is not loud yet, but it is the particular sound of a room filling with men who have come with a purpose. Boots, the scrape of a hat coming off, low voices arranged into the shape of politeness, somebody clearing his throat because he has rehearsed something and is nervous about it. There will be a dozen of them within the half hour, and there will be more behind them. You brush the crumbs from the front of your gown with the flat of your hand, carefully, because the crumbs of a white loaf show against dark cloth, and because you will be standing in the light of a window shortly with people looking at you. The Queen's chamberer opens the inner door. The Queen is coming through, and the day's business is about to begin. And you take your place behind and to the left of the chair, and fold your hands, and wait. The chair the Queen sits in is not a comfortable chair. It has a back and arms and a cushion, and it is placed on a low dais with a cloth of estate hanging above it. And everything about it is designed to be looked at rather than rested in. She sits straight. She will sit straight for the better part of 2 hours. You stand behind and slightly to the left, close enough to hear everything, and far enough that no one addresses you, and your hands stay folded at the front of your gown, where they can be seen to be doing nothing. That is the first thing to understand about the morning's work. Your job is to be visible and to be still. A queen surrounded by 5 women in good cloth is a different object from a queen sitting alone, and the difference is the whole point. You are furniture with a memory. The men come forward one at a time, and a gentleman usher decides the order, and the order is not the order in which they arrived. A knight of an old family will go before a merchant who has been waiting since first light. A servant carrying a letter from a great lady will go before both of them. The usher makes these decisions in a few seconds, standing at the door, reading coats and cloth, and the quality of a horse he saw in the yard an hour ago, and he is almost never wrong, because being wrong about it is the one thing that would cost him his place. The first man wants a wardship. The second wants a lease renewed on Abbey land his father held. The third has come about a nephew and a place in somebody's household. The fourth has a lawsuit that has gone against him in a county court, and wants it looked at again by someone with a longer arm. None of them is asking the Queen to do the thing itself. That is worth slowing down for, because it is the mechanism that everything at this court runs on, and it is easy to get wrong. A request does not travel in a straight line. It begins in a manor house in Norfolk or Devon, where a man of moderate estate wants something that only the Crown can give. An office, a wardship, a pardon, a license, a favourable hearing. He cannot write to the King. He would not dream of it. Instead, he works out who he knows, who knows somebody nearer. Perhaps his wife's cousin served the Queen's mother. Perhaps his neighbour's son is a page in a great household. He writes to that person, and he encloses something, and the something matters. A brace of birds, a barrel of oysters, a piece of plate, a sum of money made to look like a gift. The letter is elaborate in its courtesy, and quite plain in its content. He states the thing he wants. He states what he has done in the past for the family he is writing to, and he offers to do more. That letter travels. If it does its work, the recipient mentions the matter to someone closer still, and eventually the request arrives here, in the mouth of a man on one knee in front of a chair, and it has passed through 4 hands to get here, and each of those hands has taken a small share of the credit and expects a small share of the return. The Queen listens. She says she will speak to the right person. Sometimes she means it. Sometimes she is being courteous, and the man will hear nothing again, and will spend 8 months writing hopeful letters to a chamber that has already forgotten him. There is no way for him to tell the difference from her face, and she has practiced that face for a long time. What the whole system produces is a permanent traffic of small obligations, and that traffic is how power actually moves. The great offices and the sealed grants are the visible part. Underneath them, there is a constant flow of favours the size of a lease, a licence to export wool, a place for a boy, a word to a judge. Nobody records most of it. It is all done by voice in rooms like this one, between people who have known each other's families for 2 generations. You have a stake in it, and yours is a small one, and you are conscious of exactly how small. Twice a month, sometimes more, you write home. Your father wants to know 2 things: what is being said, and whether you have found an opportunity to mention the matter of the mill. There is a mill on the edge of your father's land that has been in dispute since before you were born, and it is not a large thing, and it will not be settled by anyone in this room. But he asks about it in every letter because it is the thing he thinks about at night. You have never mentioned it to the Queen. You will not. You understand something your father does not, which is that a woman in your position has a fixed and very small number of requests in her, and that spending one of them is like spending a coin you cannot replace. What you can do is smaller and more useful. You can say to another woman in the chamber that your brother is looking for a place, and let it sit there and see whether it goes anywhere. You can be pleasant to the usher who arranges the order at the door consistently for years, so that when a man arrives with your father's badge on his sleeve, the usher does not leave him standing in the cold until dinner. You can carry a letter to a lady who is difficult to reach. That is the level at which you operate, and it is not nothing. But it is not what your family imagines when they picture you standing behind that chair. They imagine a whisper. There is almost never a whisper. The letters themselves are worth a moment. You write your own, which is not universal in this chamber, and is a small point of pride. 2 of the women here write their own hands fluently and quickly. 2 write slowly, in a large, careful script, and prefer to dictate anything of length to a clerk who will render it properly. 1 does not write at all beyond her name, and nobody thinks less of her for it, because she was married at 14 into a family that valued other accomplishments. And she came to the chamber with 3 languages of conversation and no ink on her fingers. There are 2 hands in use. There is the round, upright, formal hand, the one taught for display, slow and beautiful, used for anything that will be read by someone important or kept. And there is the running secretary hand, fast, sloped, full of loops and shortcuts, in which the letter E is a shape you would not recognize unless you had been taught it, and the word which is compressed into something like a single stroke with a flourish over it. Business is done in the second hand. It is designed to be written quickly by a person with a lot to get through, and read quickly by a person with more. A letter is folded, not enveloped. You fold it into a narrow packet, tuck one end into a slit cut in the paper, and seal it with wax and the impression of a ring. The seal is not decoration. It is the only thing standing between your words and every literate person between here and Kent, and it works about as well as you would expect, which is to say that anyone who wants to read your letter can read your letter, and everybody knows it, and everybody writes accordingly. You have never put anything in a letter that would trouble you if it were read aloud. Neither has anyone else in this chamber who has been here longer than a season. The morning grinds forward. A man in a good gown that is 8 years out of fashion asks for the continuation of a small annuity granted to his father. The Queen inclines her head and says the matter will be looked into. He backs away with a face that says he has heard those words before, in this room, from a different chair. A woman comes forward, which happens perhaps twice in a morning. She's a widow, and she's here about the wardship of her own son, because when a man holding land of the crown dies leaving a child, the child and the child's lands go into the king's gift, and the king sells that gift to whoever will pay, and the person who buys it controls the boy's marriage and the profits of his estate until he comes of age. She wants to buy her own son. She has brought a figure with her, and the figure is written on a paper she holds in both hands, and she has clearly spent a long time arriving at it. She speaks well. She does not weep, and you can see the effort that costs, and you look at a point on the far wall until she has finished. The Queen says she will speak to the master of the wards. That is a real answer, better than most in this room have had. The woman goes out, and you find that you are still holding your hands exactly as you were, and that your shoulders have set hard as a board. Then a man about Elise. Then a man about a nephew. Then a letter handed up from a great household in the north, which the Queen reads herself at once, without expression, and passes to nobody. There is a rhythm to it after a while, and the rhythm is the granting and the setting aside, and your silence covering both equally. A man leaves with his life changed, and you did not move. A man leaves with nothing, and you did not move. If your face had shown anything on either occasion, it would have been noted, and it would have travelled. And by supper somebody would have known that the Queen's woman looked pleased when the northern letter came in. And by the end of the week, that would have become a sentence with a shape to it, and somebody's name attached. So you stand, and your hands stay folded, and the light from the window moves slowly along the floor toward the dais, and the usher opens the door again. The last of them goes out a little before 11, and the usher shuts the door, and the room changes. It does not change loudly. Nobody exhales in relief, because that too would be noted. But the Queen rises and moves to the window side of the chamber, where the light is best, and a chamberer brings the low chairs and stools forward, and two of the women go to the chest by the wall and bring out the work baskets, and within a few minutes the whole room has rearranged itself around a different kind of labour. You take your place on a stool near the second window. The basket set beside you is not yours alone. It holds the shared things, the shears, the papers of needles, the beeswax for drawing the thread through, the small wound cards of silk. Your own linen is folded on top, where you left it yesterday afternoon, at the point where the light failed. What you are making this week is shirts. Not fine shirts, not the Queen's, which are made by two of the older women, and nobody else, and which are counted and recorded and kept in a locked press. These are plain shirts of coarse linen, cut wide and simple, and there are a great many of them, and they are going out of the palace as soon as they are finished. That is the point of them. A Queen's household gives clothing to the poor of the parishes it passes through, and the parishes near the houses it keeps. And somebody has to make the clothing, and the somebody is the women in this room, sitting in a half-circle by the window, with their heads down. Here is something easy to misunderstand about this hour of the day. If you saw a painting of it, you would call it leisure. Women seated, hands busy, a lute somewhere, the light coming in. It looks like the picture of doing nothing gracefully. It is not doing nothing. It is production, and it has a schedule, and it has an output, and somebody keeps a rough tally of it. Consider what a single shirt takes. The linen has to be cut, and the cutting is done economically because linen is not cheap. Even the coarse sort, and every finger's width wasted, is a finger's width paid for. Then it is sewn entirely by hand, every seam with a running stitch small enough that the seam holds under washing. A plain shirt of this kind, made by a woman who has done it 1,000 times, is perhaps 6 or 7 hours of steady work. Not 6 hours of concentration, since you can talk while you do it, and you do, but 6 hours of hands. You are not fast at this. 2 of the women here are much faster, and one of them is faster than anybody you have ever seen, and she does not appear to look at what she is doing at all. Now hold that against the other kind of work in the basket, because the difference between them is the whole social geography of the room. Underneath your shirt linen, there is a strip of finer cloth, and on it you are doing black work. This is the fashionable embroidery of the moment. Black silk on white linen, worked in tiny counted stitches into patterns of vines and knots and small repeated flowers. And it goes on the collars and the cuffs and the edges of the smock that shows at the neck of a gown. It is the thing everybody sees. It sits exactly where the eye goes. a pair of embroidered cuffs, densely worked, is not 6 hours. It is 30, 40, sometimes more, spread over weeks in the good light between other duties. And that is only black silk. There is also gold, which is not thread as you would think of thread, but fine metal wound around a silk core, and which cannot be pulled through the cloth repeatedly because it frays and dulls. So it is laid on the surface and stitched down with a second thread in a technique that takes a great deal longer and cannot be hurried and cannot be unpicked cleanly if you go wrong. Gold thread is bought by weight. A single ounce costs more than a labouring man earns in a fortnight. When you work with it, you work with a paper under your hands to catch the fragments, and the fragments are collected, because they are worth collecting. So the basket in front of you contains, at the same moment, cloth that is meant to be given away to a stranger who will wear it until it falls apart, and thread that is measured in ounces and priced like a small jewel. Both of these are your work. The room does not treat them as different activities. You will do an hour of one, and then an hour of the other. And if a great lady comes through, she may sit down and take up the plain shirt work herself. And that is entirely ordinary, and nobody remarks on it. Much of what leaves this room is not charity at all. It is diplomacy. An embroidered shirt or a worked cushion cover or an altar cloth is a gift. And a gift in this court is a message with a value attached to it. And the value is understood precisely by everyone who receives it. A queen who sends a bishop an altar frontal worked in gold by her own women has said several things at once about her piety, her household, her regard for him, and her wealth. And she has said them without writing a word that anyone could later read out in an unfriendly voice. Some of it goes further than a bishop. Cloth has crossed the sea in both directions as a matter of diplomacy for as long as there have been courts. And the women who make it are the mechanism of that. And nobody's name goes on it. So the correction is this. The idleness of the Queen's women is a story told by people who were not in the room, who saw seated bodies and quiet hands, and assumed that the absence of noise was the absence of work. Everything in this chamber has an output. The output leaves and is used and is worn and is counted, and the women who made it stay where they are and start the next one. A little after the hour, one of the younger women is sent for the lute. She brings it and tunes it, which takes longer than the playing will, because gut strings in a cold January chamber will not hold a pitch for anything. And then she plays, and after a while, 3 of them sing a part song together, and one of the parts is not sung especially well, and everybody knows whose it is, and nobody says so. You do not put the needle down while this happens. That is worth understanding. Music here is not an event that replaces work. It runs underneath it. The hands keep going, but you will be asked to play, probably before Lent, and you have known that for weeks. You were taught the lute from the age of about 7 in your father's house in Kent by a man who came twice a week and was paid badly and was patient with you longer than he was paid to be. You were taught to sing a line and hold it against 2 others. You were taught French well enough to read it easily and to speak it in the careful, slightly formal register that means everyone can hear where you learned it. And you were taught to dance from about the same age as you were taught the lute. And you were taught to sit a horse, and you were taught to write a clean italic hand rather than the crabbed secretary hand of clerks. None of this was decoration. Your father was not paying a music master twice a week out of a love of music. Each of these skills was an investment with an expected return, and the return was a position, and the position was this room, and beyond this room, a marriage better than the one your family could have arranged without it. Accomplishment was capital. It was one of the very few forms of capital a family could put into a daughter and get out again. And it had a market rate, in the sense that everyone could see roughly what it was worth. A gentlewoman who plays and sings and speaks French and dances well is placed. A gentlewoman who does none of those things, from the same family with the same lands, is placed less well, or later, or further from the center of things. Which brings you to the part of it that nobody explains to a girl of 7. The woman who plays best in this chamber is watched the most. Not admired the most, though sometimes that too. Watched. When she plays, the room turns toward her, and the room includes the Queen and the Queen's women, and whoever has come in at the door and stayed to listen, and any of the King's household who happen to be passing through the outer chamber with the door standing open, which happens often and is not always an accident. To be good at this is to be visible. To be visible in this court is to be discussed. And to be discussed is to have your name enter a conversation you are not present at, and to have that conversation shaped by people whose interests are not yours. So, the skill you were bought at 7 is also the mechanism by which you can be talked about at 24, and there is no way to have one without the other. And there is no version of this post where you are not looked at. That is the working condition. You perform in order to hold a position whose central duty is to be seen performing. The girl finishes her song, somebody asks for it again, and she plays it again, less carefully and better, the way second attempts often are. You draw your thread through the wax and start a new length, and count 6 stitches along the linen, and settle the pattern where it should be. Outside, past the window, the river has that flat winter color it keeps all afternoon. Down in the court, somebody is unloading something from a cart, with a great deal of shouting about it. The light on your hands is good for perhaps 2 hours more. You know exactly how much you can finish in it, and you have already decided what to leave until tomorrow. Go back a little, to the middle of the day, because the hall is where the court is most itself, and it deserves to be watched properly. At 11 in the morning, a horn sounds in the base court, and the sound of it carries up through stone and glass and into every chamber of the palace at once. Work is set down, thread is wound onto its card, and the needle pushed into the fold of the linen, where it will not be lost. Somebody straightens somebody else's hood. 2 of the older women exchange a look about who will walk where, and settle it without a word. The way people settle things they have already argued about a year ago. Dinner is the main meal of the day, and it is not eaten in the evening. It arrives near midday, and it is eaten in daylight, which matters because a hall lit by winter sun through high windows is a very different room from a hall lit by candles. In daylight, everything is legible. Who sits where? Who is served first? whose plate is silver and whose is pewter, whose sleeves are furred, and with what? The great hall at Greenwich is enormous and cold and full of noise. The floor is strewn with rushes, changed often enough in a royal house, less often in a poorer one. There are trestle tables running the length of the room, and at the upper end, raised on a dais, the high table. Between the two lies the entire architecture of the English court, expressed in furniture. Here is something worth slowing down for, because the seating is not decoration, and it is not habit. It is the household's constitution, written every day at the same hour, in bodies. Every person in the hall knows their place in the order, and every person knows everybody else's, and the knowledge is precise. Not roughly precise, exactly precise. A knight's daughter, serving in the Queen's chamber, sits above a gentleman usher and below a baron's wife. And if the arrangement is disturbed, she notices before she has finished sitting down. The court runs to something over 1,000 people at full strength, and a good number of them eat in this hall or in a dozen other rooms, feeding off the same kitchens. And all of them are ranked, and the ranking is administered by officers whose actual job is to know it. The food comes up in a procession. This is not a figure of speech. Dishes are carried from the kitchens across an open court, which is why so much of what arrives at table is barely warm, and they come in under the eye of the ushers. And at the high table, the service is done kneeling, or half-kneeling, by men who are themselves gentlemen, and would be masters in their own counties. Food is not shared out from a central platter to individuals. It is delivered in messes. A mess is a serving intended for 4 people who sit together and eat from the same dishes. And what your mess receives depends on where your mess sits. The high table might have 20 dishes set before it across 2 courses. A mess further down the hall receives fewer and simpler, and 1 course rather than 2. Nobody pretends otherwise. It would not occur to anyone to pretend otherwise. Rank is not a private opinion held about a person. It is a quantity of food and a distance from the salt. You eat with 3 others, and you know all 3 well, because you eat with them almost every day, and you have learned which of them takes the best of the meat first, and which of them does not. The court is a place of tremendous formality, where 4 women share a bowl, and one of them always gets the wing. The serving itself is a performance, and at the highest level it involves tasting. Before the king or queen is served, portions are touched, tasted, or passed against the dish by an officer. Part precaution, part ceremony. Mostly ceremony by now, but done every day with complete seriousness. Bread is cut for the sovereign by a particular officer with a particular knife. The napkin is laid across a shoulder in a particular way. These men have inherited their offices, or bought them, or been granted them for service, and each of them would tell you that the office is ancient, and that the manner of doing it has never changed, and each of them would be partly wrong, and none of them would care. Now, what is actually on the table in January? Not what a picture would suggest. The great myth of a Tudor feast is a table groaning under roast meats, and a man tearing a leg off something with his hands. There is roast meat, and a great deal of it on the days when meat is allowed. But this is winter, and more than that, this is a Wednesday, and Wednesday is a fish day, and so are Fridays, and Saturdays, and the whole of Lent, and the eves of a long list of feasts. Between the church's rules and the Crown's own statutes encouraging the fishing trade, something close to half the days of the year are days on which flesh is not eaten in a well-run household. So the dishes coming up the hall are fish, salt cod, soaked and boiled, herring, pickled or smoked, in quantities that would astonish a modern kitchen, pike if the ponds have given one up, eels, whiting, ling, oysters, which are cheap and common and eaten by everyone, and which nobody in this hall considers a luxury of any kind. Stockfish beaten and softened and served with butter and mustard, because on its own it has the texture of a plank. There is bread, a great deal of it, in grades. The white manchet at the top of the hall, finer flour, smaller loaf, coarser brown loaves further down. Bread is also a plate, in older practice, and still in some places, a thick trencher slice that soaks up sauce and is afterward collected for the poor at the gate, along with the leftovers, which are gathered in baskets by the almoner and given out. That is not sentiment either. It is a department with an officer and an accounting. There are sauces, and they are sharp and spiced, vinegar and verjuice and ginger and pepper and cinnamon, because the taste of the period runs to sourness and spice together in a way most modern palates find startling. There are custards and fritters and a tart of some dried fruit. At the high table, near the end, something built out of sugar and almond paste, coloured and gilded, meant more to be admired than eaten. What there is very little of, at your end of the hall, or the upper end either, is anything a modern eye would call a vegetable. Roots and cabbage and onions and leeks and beans exist in enormous quantity, but they are largely in the pottage, the thick daily soup that feeds the lower household, and they carry a whiff of poverty at high table. The finer you are, the further you eat from the ground. It is a foolish rule, and it is followed exactly. And nobody is drinking water. This is worth a moment. It is not that Tudor people believed water was poison, quite. Spring water was drunk and praised, and there were fine conduits at some houses. But river water in a city, and standing water anywhere near 1,000 people and their horses, is genuinely not safe. And everybody knows this by experience, even if nobody knows why. And more than that, water is thought to be a cold and thin thing that does not nourish. Ale nourishes. Ale is food. So the household drinks ale, and it drinks it at breakfast, at dinner, at supper, and in between. And the small ale served ordinarily is weak, weaker than most modern beer, made to be drunk in quantity across a working day. The allowance for a person in a great household runs to something like 1 gallon a day, which sounds like drunkenness and is not, because the drink at that volume is largely water that has been made safe by brewing and given some calories on the way. The scale of it is the part that stops you. A royal household consumes ale by the hundreds of thousands of gallons in a year. The brewhouse never stops. Barrels come in by cart and by barge, and the empties go back out. Wine comes from Gascony and the Rhine and Greece and Spain, and the good wine is served at the upper tables and is drunk from glass or from silver, and further down there is no wine at all. Set that against your fee. £10 a year, paid at the 2 terms, with your lodging and your diet found. The ale you drink in a year, bought at market price, would cost a labouring man a serious portion of his wages. You never see the bill for any of it. It is the most consistently valuable part of your position, and it is invisible to you precisely because it arrives at your elbow every day without being asked for. The meal runs perhaps an hour and a half. There is grace at the beginning and grace at the end, and between them a level of noise that would make conversation at your own mess difficult if you were saying anything worth hearing. And mostly you are not, because the things worth saying are not said in a hall with 300 people in it. Then the ushers move, and the cloth is drawn from the tables, and that gesture ends the meal as decisively as the horn began it. The noise drops by half in the space of a minute. Benches scrape. The dogs, who have been under the tables the whole time, and about whom nobody has said anything, are chased toward the screen's passage with a general lack of conviction. You rise with the other women and follow the Queen out through the door behind the dais, and the cold of the passage after the warmth of that packed room is startling and welcome, and gone in 20 paces. The afternoon is in front of you, short and grey, and already thinking about its own ending. The Queen walks after dinner, and because the Queen walks, you walk. This is not a stroll taken for pleasure, though pleasure is sometimes in it. It is understood in the same way that Mass in the morning is understood, as something that belongs in the day and would be noticed if it were missing. Physicians of the period write about it in the plainest terms. The body, they say, thickens and grows sluggish if it is kept still after a heavy meal, and the humours settle badly, and a person who eats and then sits will suffer for it. Walking after dinner is medicine. It is prescribed the way a diet of fish on a Friday is prescribed, and it is followed for a mixture of belief and habit that nobody bothers to separate. In January at Greenwich, the walking happens in the long gallery more often than in the garden. The gallery runs the length of one range of the palace, windowed down one side, and it exists in large part for exactly this, a covered place to move in weather that does not permit moving outside. The floor is boarded. The windows are glazed, which is worth noticing, because glass in this quantity is a statement of wealth as loud as any tapestry, and the light coming through it on a grey afternoon is thin and even and cold, and it falls in long rectangles across the boards, and you walk through one, and then the next, and then the next. You walk 2 by 2 behind the Queen, at a pace set entirely by her. If she slows to look out at the river, the whole line slows. If she stops to speak to someone, you stop, and you arrange yourself at a distance that lets you be summoned, but does not let you overhear. And you have learned exactly what that distance is, without anyone ever telling you the measurement. Some afternoons, the weather is clear enough for the garden, and then you go out into it in cloaks, past the low clipped hedges and the beds that, in January, hold nothing but earth and the woody stems of last year's herbs. Tudor pleasure gardens are geometric things, squares and knots and rails painted in the household colours, green and white, and they are designed to be looked down on from an upper window as much as walked in. In summer, this garden is a working part of the palace's social life. In winter, it is mostly a shape under frost, and the walk through it is short, and everybody is glad to come back in. Here is something the shape of that afternoon walk conceals. The palace you are walking in is not permanent to you, and it is not permanent to anybody. In 8 weeks, or 10, or 6, everything in it that is not fixed to the walls will be packed into carts and taken somewhere else. The court moves. It moves constantly. Henry VIII held something in the region of 60 houses over the course of his reign, and while he never used all of them, he used a great many, and the movement between them is one of the defining facts of the life you are living. Greenwich, Richmond, Hampton Court, Whitehall, Windsor, and in the summer months, a long looping progress out into the countryside, staying at the houses of nobles and gentlemen who are honoured and ruined in roughly equal measure by the visit. There are reasons, and they are not romantic. The first is straightforwardly practical. A household of 800 people generates waste at a rate that a single site cannot absorb indefinitely. Kitchen refuse, ash, the contents of the privies, the straw and dung from stables holding hundreds of horses. The house must be emptied so it can be scoured, the rushes taken up and burned, the privies emptied, the whole place aired and lime-washed and made habitable again. The word used in the accounts is sweetening. The house is left to sweeten. It is not a metaphor. It is an instruction to the clerks who stay behind. The second reason is supply. Feeding 800 people out of one district strips that district. The purveyors buy grain, ale, meat, fish, wood and candles from the surrounding countryside at prices the crown sets rather than the market, which is one of the most bitterly resented royal rights of the age. And after 2 months in one place, there is simply less to buy nearby. Moving the court moves the burden. The third reason is political, and it is the one that matters most to the men who make the decisions. A king who stays in one place is a king only that place ever sees. A king who moves through his counties is seen, and being seen is most of what medieval and Tudor kingship consists of. He hunts in a shire, he stays with its leading family, he receives its petitions, and the shire remembers for a decade. None of this is your decision, and all of it lands on you. A move begins with a list. The Lord Chamberlain's department settles the date and the destination, and word goes down through the household, and then the packing starts, and it is astonishing in scale. Beds are taken apart. The Queen's bed, hangings and curtains and mattresses, and the frame itself travels with her, because the beds in the next house may be inadequate, and in any case are not hers. Tapestries come down off the walls and are rolled, and tapestries are among the most valuable movable goods the crown owns, worth more than the plate in some cases, and they are handled accordingly. Plate goes into chests bound with iron and travels under guard. Kitchen equipment, spits and cauldrons, and the great brass pots goes in carts. The chapel goes, vestments and plate and books. The wardrobe of the beds and the wardrobe of the robes are entire departments whose whole reason for existing is the management of this movement. The carts number in the dozens for a short move and in the hundreds for a summer progress. The horses number in the hundreds either way. Some of the household ride ahead, the harbingers, whose job is to arrive at the destination first and assign lodgings, chalking names on doors, and their arrival is dreaded by whoever must lose a room. Your own part in it comes down to one chest. That is not an exaggeration, and it is worth sitting with, because it is one of the plainest measures of what your position actually gives you. A gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber travels with a chest, sometimes 2 if she is fortunate, and if a cart can be found for the second. In it, your gowns, folded with the sleeves packed separately, and lavender or rosemary among the folds against moths. Your smocks and kirtles. Your hoods, which are wired and awkward and dent if they are packed carelessly. Your shoes. A small box for your jewels and pins, which does not leave your own hands or your servants', your primer. Perhaps a book. Perhaps a needlework piece in progress, rolled in linen. A comb, a mirror of polished steel, if you have one. A few small things of no value to anybody but you. That is the sum of what you own outright at the age of 24, in the household of a Queen of England. Everything else in your life is lent to you. The bed you sleep in belongs to the crown. The chamber belongs to the crown. The candles are issued and counted. The food arrives without your involvement, and would stop arriving the instant your name came off the list. Your gowns are the closest thing you have to capital, which is exactly why so much of your family's money went into them, and why you keep them the way another woman keeps coin. If you were dismissed tomorrow, the chest is what would go with you, and the horse, if it is yours, and nothing else. Meanwhile, the walking continues, and so does the talking. And the talking is the other half of the afternoon's real work. Understand what the privy chamber is in this respect. It is the room fewest people can enter, and the room where the most is known. Every scrap of information that reaches the Queen passes through women who were standing near enough to hear it. Which ambassador asked for an audience and did not get one? Whose brother has been given a wardship? Who is out of favor this week and has not yet realized it? Which household is quietly arranging a marriage? What the king said at dinner, and far more useful, what tone he said it in. This is not idle chatter, though a man watching from the door would call it that, and has, repeatedly, in writing. It is the circulation of the only currency you can accumulate without money. A woman who knows a thing 3 days before, it is common knowledge, can write to her family and give them 3 days. And 3 days is sometimes the whole distance between a request granted and a request that arrives too late. But there are rules, and you learned them fast, because the penalty for learning them slowly is not a scolding. Anything concerning the king's mind is not repeated. Anything concerning the Queen's health, her temper, her private words is not repeated. Anything concerning religion, in this particular decade, is not repeated in any form whatsoever, not as opinion, not as report, not as a question asked in apparent innocence. Anything that could be traced back to a single mouth in a room of 6 women is not said in a room of 6 women. What is safe? Appointments and offices, which are public within a day anyway. Marriages, births, arrivals, departures, prices, weather, the state of the roads, the health of people outside the royal family. Fashion, endlessly, which is safe precisely because it is taken to be trivial, and is therefore where a great deal of information about who is rising and who is falling actually travels. So you walk, and you say the safe things at a volume that carries, and the other things at a volume that does not, and you say a third category of thing not at all, and you have become so practiced at sorting between them that you no longer notice you are doing it. By 3 o'clock the light is going. In January, at this latitude, the afternoon collapses rather than fades. The rectangles on the gallery floor lose their edges, then their brightness, then themselves, and the windows turn from something you see through into something you see. The river outside goes from grey to darker grey. The grooms come with candles and tapers, and the smell of the day changes, tallow in the passages, and wax where the Queen is, and the palace stops being a place lit from outside and becomes a place lit from within. The Queen goes back to her lodgings. You follow her, and the evening begins. Supper is the smaller meal, and it comes early. By 4 o'clock, the boards are up again in the Queen's chamber, though not the great trestles of the hall, only the smaller tables for the Queen, and those who eat in her presence. The dishes come in fewer numbers. Where dinner ran to 2 courses of many dishes each, supper is lighter, and in January it is mostly what the kitchens have been holding since morning. Cold meat carved thin, a pottage of onions and herbs, bread still, always bread, and ale, a dish of pears baked with honey, and a great deal of cinnamon, which is the sort of thing that appears at the end of a winter supper, because the fruit is stored and softening, and the spice covers the fact. You eat standing, or you eat after, depending on the day and on who is present. Tonight there is a mess set for the Queen's women, and you take your place at it and eat quickly, because you already know what the evening holds, and you would rather not be doing it on a full stomach in a gown that has no give in it anywhere. The cloths come off. The tables come down and go out through the door in sections, carried by grooms who have done this so many thousands of times that they do not speak while doing it. The chamber empties of furniture and fills with people, and in the space of perhaps a quarter of an hour, a room where 12 women were sewing this morning becomes a room where 60 people are standing. The musicians come in and set up near the window end, where the acoustics are best, and where they will be out of the way of the floor. Lutes, a pair of viols, a recorder consort, 3 of them, boys and a man. Sometimes a virginal is carried in, which takes 4 men and a certain amount of swearing that is done quietly. And then there is dancing. Here is what is easy to misunderstand about it. You are not dancing for pleasure, though you may take pleasure in it, and you probably do, because you are good at it, and people generally enjoy the things they are good at. You are dancing because dancing is the evening's principal business, and you are one of the people whose post requires her to conduct it well. A pavan is not a diversion. It is a public demonstration, performed in a lit room in front of the entire assembled court, of grace, memory, breeding, physical control, and the capacity to be looked at by 100 people without faltering. You have been practicing for this since you were 7 years old. That is not a figure of speech. You learned the bas dance, and the pavan, and the almen in your father's hall in Kent, from a man who came 3 times a week and was paid for it. And you learned the galliard later, and with more difficulty, because the galliard requires you to leave the ground and land again in time and in order, in skirts, in front of people. You practiced the 5 steps and the cadence, and the leaping variations that the ambitious attempt and the wise attempt only when they are certain. You practiced until the counting went out of your head and into your feet, which is the only place it is any use, because if you are counting in your head, you cannot also be smiling and holding a conversation with your eyes and noticing who has entered the room. The pavana goes first, because it always does. It is slow and processional, and everybody can manage it. which is precisely why it opens. It lets the whole room onto the floor at once and establishes, by who leads and who follows and who partners whom, the entire evening's order of precedence without a word being said about it. 2 steps forward and a close. 2 steps forward and a close. Sink and rise. The gowns move very well in it. That is not accidental. The dance was designed for the clothes, or the clothes were designed for the dance. And after enough years, the question stops being interesting. Then the galliard, and the room thins to those who can. You can. You go out with a partner assigned by the arrangement of the evening, rather than chosen, and you do the 5 steps, and the leap, and the landing, and the heavy skirt swings out and comes back, and does not catch, and you come down on the beat, and not a half beat after it. And somewhere in the 2nd measure, you register that the Queen is watching, and that a good deal of the room is watching the Queen watch. And you do the 3rd variation anyway, because you have it, and this is what the post is. That is the working condition. Everything you have been trained to do since childhood, you do in a lit room in front of the people who will decide what happens to you. There is a category of knowledge required of a woman in this chamber that has nothing to do with her feet. You are expected to speak French, and to speak it well enough to hold a conversation with an ambassador's man who has been sent to make conversation and report on it. You are expected to have read something, not everything, and not too openly, but something. The Psalms in some form, a devotional work, perhaps a book of courtesy. And if you are fortunate and your father indulged you, some poetry. You are expected to know who is married to whom across half the noble houses of England, and to hold that map in your head and update it constantly, because it is the map on which every conversation in this room is actually taking place. And you are expected to know, precisely and at all times, what may be said and what may not. This is the hardest of the accomplishments, and the only one that is never taught directly. The religious question runs under this whole decade like water under a floor, and there is not a woman in this chamber who has not privately worked out where she stands on it, and there is not a woman in this chamber who says so. You can hold an opinion. You cannot voice one. The distinction is the entire skill. So you talk about the music. You talk about the Kentish roads. You say a thing about a French sleeve that means something else entirely to the 2 people who are meant to understand it, and nothing at all to anyone else. And you have said nothing, and you have said a great deal. There is one more part of the evening's economy worth naming, because it explains why women stayed in a post that costs more than it pays. Gifts. On the 1st day of January, the entire court gives to the king and the queen, and the king and the queen give back, and every single item is written down. There are rolls kept for it, listing giver and gift and value, and they survive, and you can read what a gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber handed over, and what she received in return. You gave, perhaps, a shirt you embroidered yourself over 3 months, or a purse of your own working, because handwork given to a monarch is understood to carry more weight than its cost. And you received, in the usual way, a piece of gilt plate, weighed and recorded to the ounce. That plate is not an ornament. It is money in a shape. A gilt cup of 8 or 9 ounces can be sold, or pawned, or broken and coined, and everyone in this room understands that. and no one says it. Over 5 or 6 years in service, the plate accumulates, and it is very often the most substantial thing a woman brings out of court with her when she leaves it to be married. There are gifts in the other direction all year, too. Cloth at the great feasts, coin at a christening, a gown the Queen has finished with, handed down entire, which is worth more than a quarter's fee, and is also a public statement about your standing, which is worth more again. This is the answer to the question your father was really asking when he spent what he spent to place you here. The fee is small, the costs are large. The plate, the cloth, the favor, and the marriage that comes of proximity are what the family was buying. It is past 9. The musicians have gone from dance measures to something slower, and the room has thinned without anyone announcing that it should. The candles have burned down to the point where the light has gone yellow and low and forgiving, and the far corners of the chamber have given up being visible. Someone has stopped playing the lute mid-phrase, and no one has minded. The Queen rises. That is the signal, and the room knows it before she has finished standing. You go with her through into the bedchamber, and you do in reverse everything you did in the dark of this morning. The hood comes off, and the pins come out one at a time, and go into the dish. The sleeves are unpinned and laid flat. The gown is unlaced from the back and lifted away, and it is as heavy going as it was coming. The kirtle, the petticoat, the smock stays. The linen is folded by hands, whose task that is, and the fire is banked, and the curtains of the great bed are drawn along their rings, with a sound like a long breath. And then you go out, and the passage is very cold after that room, and you climb to your own chamber and get into the shared bed in the dark, without waking the woman already in it. Consider what today required of you. You woke in the dark, dressed in clothing that needs another person to fasten, stood for hours without leaning, carried and knelt and fetched, held your face still through business that concerned your family's fortunes, embroidered work that will leave this palace as diplomacy, ate what and where and when your rank permitted, sorted every sentence you heard into 3 categories before deciding what to do with it, and then danced a galliard in front of the court on a January evening at the end of it. That is skill. Every part of it is skill, learned and practiced and real, and you are good at it, and being good at it is not nothing. And none of it is yours. The fee is small, and the costs exceed it. The plate is a gift, which can stop. The post is held at pleasure, which can end. Your place here rests on a marriage negotiated for you, and a queen's favor that no one in this palace controls, including the Queen. Do the work perfectly for 10 years, and you may still leave with a chest, some gilt plate, and a husband chosen in Kent. That is not a judgment on you. It is a description of the structure you are standing in. The bed curtains are drawn. The fire is down to red. Somewhere below, the river goes on, moving past Greenwich in the dark, the way it did before any of this, the way it will after.